Welcome to the show, everybody. It's your bud, the RC Guru for Dialed In RC, a DialedInTV.com production. We are so excited about this show. Sometimes, every now and then, we put on a show where we give away tips and we do little things with the RC cars and RC trucks and planes, trains, whatever it is we're working on for that day. We give out a few secrets, race tips, setup tips, whatever you like to call it. That's what we're going to do. Today, we are going to go from a outdoor setup with this car here, which is my 1/10 scale pan car. Pan cars, because they used to call them like pancake cars because they were flat bottom and they just, you know, had straight axles all the way across, and you just raced them, and they were very, very low, high downforce vehicles. Low to the ground, they suck down pretty good. These now are called your World GT cars. As you can see here, lined up on the table here, I've got a few tools here. I'm gonna go through some of these tools before we begin. Like, this is a digital micrometer. This is gonna help me to gauge a few distances and gaps and things of that nature. This one's digital, but at the same token, I have a manual. Every now and then the digital battery might run out, and then there's this little pointer gauge right here whereby I can go inside with a very, very fine detail, as you guys can see, and utilize this to gauge. And I read it up here, you know, whatever it is. Like if I wanted to take, for instance, and gauge how much of the area is inside of this pair of needle nose pliers, I couldn't do it by measuring the inside like this to go to that way, like that inside. So the best way to do it is to utilize this tool here, and I can put it inside the hole there, the depth of the hole, just like that, and then I can push the gauge to it and take a measurement off of that. And if you look here real detailed, you see the measurement right in here. It's like maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's 5.5 centimeters of depth going inside of that hole. So that's what this gauge is for. It's a micrometer as well. A calibrator, it's a caliber, whatever you want to call it. You can call it whatever you call it, just as long as you have one. That's one of the tools I have. I have a set of hex drivers. These are hex wrenches. So these are my hex drivers. I have another nut driver, so that I can get inside the axle, but we're going to go through all of this with you. I have a smaller size of needle nose pliers because sometimes you need to get those E-clips and those C-clamps, and you need they really be able to fit inside there, and this size won't fit inside there, but I bet you I'll be able to get it with this right here. So I want to make certain that I have enough tools. We've got a variation of hex drivers here and hex wrenches here. We've got a ride height gauge here. This is a ride height gauge. This determines how high the chassis is off of the surface of the racetrack. So you want to, this goes in a lot of increments of a 0.5 millimeter on up to 1 millimeter to 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters, 2.5 millimeters. It just climbs up a 0.5 millimeters all the way up to 10 millimeters. For on-road vehicles, 10 millimeters is a lot of ride height. Not too many vehicles utilize 10 millimeters of ride height, especially in the World GT class. We're maybe somewhere about maybe 3.5, 4 maybe millimeters at the most. And so that's what you got. I got my needle, I got my tweezers, my needle nose tweezers. I have those there. I have a gap gauge. This has various gaps in it in different increments. It tells you, and you need this kind of stuff to determine the shimming of the rear axle. We'll get into that in detail, but each one of these, you take it and you slide the wheel in on the axle, and then you take and you measure the distance between the wheel and the rear axle pod, which is the rear axle pod is where that's the floating pod that the chassis is able to bend. You get a little bit of flex in there to ride over bumps and things of that nature, and a little bit of left and right flexing when the car is going around corners. So this gauge here, your gap gauge, is really good for that. We've got shims inside of here. We've got a various amount of pinions to determine which pinion and spur gear we're going to utilize as the combination there. So these are some of the things that you might want to have on hand if you're going to do something like this. I'm going from my outdoor setup, which is a more robust setup. And what I mean by robust, I'm talking about these gears in here. I like to keep my gears and my tires in a plastic bag and also a cellophane plastic seal bag to keep the moisture inside of the tires, to disenable or to prevent them from dry rotting. These tires that we run on asphalt surfaces and on carpet surfaces are foam tires. They are foam and rubber blended tires. I mean, real professional race rubber blended and foam combinations together to get the grip that we need on both asphalt as well as carpet surfaces. The Ozite carpet is what most professional RC indoor carpet racers race on, but you can race on basement carpet. I've raced on that before. It has a lot less traction, but you still can race on it. So what I was talking about when I mentioned a more robust combination, and I'll show you this in detail. If you look right here, the teeth on this gear is very, very fine. Very fine, like almost ultra fine, a shear type gear, almost like a belt drive, you know, very quiet, very smooth, low friction interaction between the gear and the pinion. And the pinion is this what we have here. This is your drive pinion gear. As you can see, they're in some cases they're in double seal bags, because it may take a double seal situation to keep your vehicle, keep your tires from dry rotting. You know, and that's the last thing you want, is for your tires to dry rot on you. So here's the pinion. This is an ultra fine tooth pinion. Very, very close teeth together. Ultra fine means low friction. And this is my race combination for carpet indoor. I have here a like 90 tooth spur gear right here. This is the spur gear, which is hooked up. And this gear, if you turn the axle, one tire turns one way and the other tire turns the other way. That's what's called your counter differential. So when a car goes around a corner, when you're cornering, because the rear axle is a straight axle, if this axle was locked and both of these tires were turning at the same radius, they would turn like this, and one of the tires on the outside would need to turn more than the one on the inside. So while that's taking place, you have both tires turning. You've got the outside tire turning twice as fast as the inside tire because it's on a larger radius or arc. So you want to be mindful of that. We're getting this vehicle ready to go indoors. It has an outdoor setup on it. I raced it outdoor on the asphalt throughout the summertime, and now I'm going to take it indoor to the carpet and lots of air conditioning and this, that, and the other, and the third is going to be great. And so we have to change the setup, and one of the changes on the setup is the gears. Right now I have a 48 pitch gear setup, and what I mean by 48 pitch, this right here is 64 pitch. 64 pitch is a very fine, close tooth setup. With the spur gear on here and the pinion in here, the teeth between them two, the gapping between the teeth from one tooth to the other tooth is 1/64th of an inch, okay, which is almost like a little bit like a little bit less than a millimeter, okay, or 1/16th of an inch, sort of something to that nature. But we've got 48 pitch here, which means that's like 48 millimeters or something, like, not really 48 millimeters, but in a, I guess it would, well, forget about that. I'm not going to get into the technical aspect of it because it's not really worth it. What you have is 48 pitches, a lot more thicker and a lot more robust than 64 pitch. 64 pitch is easier to strip out. If you hit something or somebody hits you, you're more likely to strip a 64 pitch pinion and spur setup because it's very fine, very small teeth, as opposed to 48 pitch. I'm going to show you the difference between the two when I get the 48 pitch off of this car. So what I'm going to do is remove the body. First I got to remove the E-clips like that, and we'll take this body, and of course we have our tires here and the plastic that our tires came in, so we'll just sit that aside over there on that table, and that's pretty good. Alright, now as you can see, 48 pitch to 48 pitch to 64 pitch looks like this. 48 pitch is just so much more thicker. The teeth bite so much more larger than the 64 pitch. So in this case, the lower the number, the larger the gear is. The lower the number, the larger the teeth on the gear are. So the higher the number, the smaller the teeth are. So if you look at the two of them here, you see, I'm going to take this 64 pitch pinion off, or this 48 pitch pinion off, and then I'm going to let you look at the two of them together, side by side, and you'll see the difference. Okay, this is once again a more robust gear. Okay, you can see it here very, very, you can really, really notice the difference. You see, these teeth are so much more larger than the teeth that are on here. And what that does is that translates to a lot more friction. And friction is heat, a lot more heat. And this is less friction, less heat. This takes more to move, it's got more mass on it. So the more mass, the more inertia, the more energy it takes to create that inertia. And so we've got the 64 pitch here. It's less energy, less inertia, and so therefore it's going to spin out a lot smoother. You're not going to really be able to see the great difference in the low speed over the high speed as you would with the 48 pitch. When you start off, you're going to see the difference between the low speed and the high speed. Like your higher RPM range and your lower RPM range, you're going to see it. It's going to be like night and day. But it's going to be more difficult to tell with the finer tooth pinion and spur that I'm about to put on carpet, because there's going to be more friction on carpet. And it's also going to be a less distance. So we want to be able to get that speed up as fast as possible. So the lighter the spur gears, and if you look at the spur gear here, the teeth on the spur gear, not only are they different in color, but the teeth are a lot smaller on 64 pitch as opposed to 48 pitch. So, now with that said, first thing I want to do, since I'm here, is I want to take my car and I want to get my micrometer. And rather than, or my caliber, whichever one you want to call it. I like to call it micrometer myself. But I'm going to measure the distance from the center of the chassis to the outer wheel. And in the center of the chassis, as you can see right here, there's a dot. You can see that dot right there. There's a dot right there. That lets you know that's the center, the very, very center of the chassis right there. That center line lines up with the dot right here on the front of the chassis. It's a dot right there. There's a hole right there. That hole there and that hole right there. Those are your pivot points. When you're setting up a chassis, not only do you want to have your setup from left to right balanced, but you also want to have front to rear balance. Front to rear balance, left to right balance. Front to rear balance, left to right balance. You want your chassis so that when you hold the car in the center of the car, like this, it should be balanced. Now my finger is not a good judgment, but as you can see, if I put my hand in the center of the car, I'm trying to get the center of the car, it should level off. Pretty much, there it is. Okay, there you go. It's not easy to do. Okay, that's very important. That helps with the transfer of weight from the rear of the car to the front of the car in braking, and from the front of the car to the rear of the car in acceleration. And when you take off, so when you take off, all of the weight moves from the front of the car to the back of the car. All the weight wants to go to the back because you're moving forward. The weight wants to stay where it is, so it stays here as the car's momentum moves forward. And what that does is that transfers all the weight back to the rear tires. This happens with every car. That's a little bit of physics there. So now that we've got the pinions off, you looked at the pinions, you've looked at the spur gear, now it's time to go to the car. Notice that the chassis is pretty low. It's pretty low. There's not a lot involved with the chassis here. Some of the things that you have, you've got a lithium-ion battery pack here, okay, or LiPo pack. You have that here, and that's a 7.4 or a 3.7. In this case, it's a 3.7 because I race legal. Another thing, you have your battery pack here. You've got your servo. Your servo is the thing that drives the front wheels. It makes the car steer left and right. Got your receiver. This is the box that receives the signal from the transmitter. As you have the wheel on the transmitter, when you turn left and right, that signal goes to this box, which transfers that signal information to this servo, which causes the wheels to turn. Then you have back here your electronic speed control. The ESC is what we call it. This box takes the power from the battery and the signal from the transmitter and converts all that energy to electrical power to power up the motor. The motor here is a brushless motor in the rear of here. Brushless meaning it has no brushes, there's no friction in there, there's just a magnetic field that drives a stator inside of this motor along with a rotor. The magnetic field is created by the stator, and the rotor is inside of the center line of the stator, and when that magnetic field comes on from the juice from the electronic speed control and the battery, what it does is it causes the rotor to begin to spin. And then there are some sensors inside here that determine how fast that rotor is spinning, and all that information is being calculated by the electronic speed control and the signal that the electronic speed control is receiving from the transmitter and your finger pulling the trigger on the transmitter. So that's how these cars work. Foam tires, gears, different gear ratios. You have a variable number of gears to get to make the car go further down the straightaway and not lose momentum or speed, or to get up the speed quickly and come out of a turn. Your gear ratio determines all of that. So now with that said, and we've got that center dot there, I'm going to go and place my mic on this very center of that dot. Now the car, it won't move. I can actually control the chassis that way, and then I close the gauge onto the tire. Now this number is vitally important. As you can see, this is what I'm doing here. This number is vitally important because you have got to have equal distance between this outside tire and this outside tire. If you don't have that equal distance, the car will crab as it goes down the straightaway. It'll crab. It'll crab like this as it goes down the straightaway. And what that is that it's not evenly, the tire patch is not evenly distributed on both sides of the center line of the car. Now that center line is important because it controls the transfer of weight forward and backwards and left and right, as I mentioned earlier. So you want to have, before you begin to balance the car out, and we balance the car out by adding lead weights to certain areas of the chassis. You put it on those two pins and it'll stand up as though, let's say this was it for an example. Let's just use this as an example. Okay, it sits on that pin there, and then it'll sit on this pin here, which is at the front of the chassis. If I can, There we go. Now, there it is right there. And it's on a flush table. Now, what happens is that if I let this go, look at that. The car sits on it. It's balanced. On both points, it's balanced. So I did a pretty good job of balancing this car. Otherwise, it would tip. But it's pretty good balanced there. It's pretty good on the center of those two tips. So that's important because that helps the left and right, the transfer of weight forth and aft on the chassis. These are dynamic forces in physics that are acting upon the chassis as it rolls. And if you don't have an idea about that kind of stuff, you can go to dialedintv.com and you can read some of our tutorials on balance, on camber and caster. That's what this gauge is for. This gauge right here is a camber and caster gauge. It measures the lean of the front wheels. Like if you needed more traction, you would lean the tire like that. If you didn't want more traction, you straighten that tire up. But this gauge measures how much you have, and you want to have an equal amount of left and right camber, which is your tire top lean in towards each other. Camber is the leaning of the top of the tire in or out. Okay? And leaning in gives you more traction. Leaning straight up gives you traction, full traction to an extent. And then as you go out, now you're taking traction away from the front end or rear of the car. So that's why this gauge is here. Remember, we've got the ride height gauge, we've got the camber and caster gauge, we've got your micrometer, digital and manual, and we got a few tools going on over here. And this is another gauge, which is called your droop gauge. This gauge determines how much this pod, this rear pod, flexes. Left, forward, and backwards. I don't know if you can see that, but it's just enough forward and backwards. That pod, that rear end is cocking. If I was to put this on to here and I was to cock the rear pod, if I cocked it, that's how much is going up and down. Right there. So you can see that it's going up and down, and that action gives you traction. When the tires begin to spin like this, when they begin to go forward like that, the chassis goes down. It pushes down to the ground because the tires are spinning this way and they're getting traction, so they want to bite. And so you have to know how much of that bend you need in order for the tires not to lose traction or break loose as they are going around and moving forward. So it's a lot of things going on there, and it takes a lot of information, but you know now. So you just play with it. You play with it. That's all you do. Play with it. So let's go forward. We've got the tire off. We know that the chassis is balanced. We're looking around. We're making an inspection. We're making sure that our shock absorber, that's right here in the center of the car, is not leaking fluid, because these are hydraulic fluid filled shocks. And they come with variations of springs. You can put a gold spring on here.